All right, let's take a look at how to black and white tone an image, do a duotone to it. So black and white always deals with tonal range and scales of gray, but when we talk about duotoning, we're actually taking those scales and working in color with them. So they're actually scales of color, but usually a single color. Almost could be described as monochromatic, but I hate the use of that word because that word is used in a different way. For example, this image here being predominantly yellow would be considered a monochromatic image because it's all based on these yellows. Anyways, back to this image. So we'll quickly go in and we will use the adjust panel, and we'll close a couple of these extra things here. We'll start with converting this image into black and white. And once again, playing around with the colors to see what it does. For instance, I'm going to pull this down and see if I can get that sky to get a little bit more dramatic. It helps a little bit, but I'm getting a little bit of the vignette from the lens, which, is a little bit problematic. So in this instance, I might use anyways, an adjustment. We'll do adjustment later on that. All right, so we've converted to black and white. We'll go into exposure. We'll pull down the exposure a little bit because it's a little on the hot side, so it probably should be somewhere around here. Don't be afraid to take your images a little bit too dark, because there is a tendency of people to tend to have their images be really too bright when looking at them. Also, make sure that your monitor is at the right brightness level when adjusting images. As a default, putting your brightness at 50% is probably the best working until you get your monitor actually calibrated. So we'll get the image to about here for our processing. As I mentioned before, I'm not a fan of using contrast, so I actually tend to go in dynamic range. First, I'll go down, pull down any highlights that I feel it might need to be pulled down, which actually helps the sky a little bit. Then I'll go ahead and kick my whites up and pull my blacks down. And then by using the clarity slider, I can go in and flatten down the spiking in the middle. Most of the tonal range in this shot is in the midtones. Then if I go in and do with layers, I can go ahead and create right here, go and say, okay, draw a linear gradient mask. I'll go ahead and click that and drag it. And you'll see that it creates one like this. And then once I do that and leave it there, then I can go ahead, while that mask is actually on, I will go in and just pull down the exposure on the mask itself, and that creates a nice darkened sky. So now I've got this image looking kind of decent. In my opinion, I think I need to go back out of the mask and go to the background, which is the actual layer itself. And I'm going to kick just a little bit more of the whites up, give it a tad bit more punch. And now the other thing I can do in my processing is also tweak with color. So I could go into, as I mentioned before, obviously there is a color editor where you can go in and grab a certain hue. And for this instance, for black and white, might be like, for example, if I wanted to see what the yellows do, if I go and mess around with the lightness or darkness of the yellow, it can affect the appearance of the yellow in the grass. So that's one thing I can do there. Obviously the saturation, I can make it less saturated or more saturated, and that could also punch up the grass a little bit. And then you would just choose other colors that you might want to adjust. For example, if we go to blue and we say we want to pull down the brightness of blue, that actually adds to a little bit more of a darkening appearance to the graduated filter that we had applied. Now, graduated filter can also be grabbed from up here, just so you know for the future. You can basically go in here and do a gradient, or you can do a radial. And I've shown you guys how to do radials before, but basically a radial would basically be choosing other areas. For right now, I can go ahead and let's add another mask to this, and I'm just going to pull up from the bottom, but I'm not going to pull up that dramatically. And once I do that, leave it, I'm going to go ahead and it's basically pulling the same adjustment as before because it's the same adjustment layer. So it's using the same formula as I did for the top. And actually, if you guys notice, I did a total mistake, and I'm glad I did that just to make sure you guys see what happened there. Because I was still working on the original layer, and I was adding that mask, it was just basically moving the mask around. So if I want a new mask for the bottom, I'd actually have to create a new mask. Then I would basically go in and draw it on the bottom like before. Now, it's not going to do anything because it's a new mask, and so the only way to get it to do something would be to go in here and go to exposure and or whatever else I want to do to it. So basically I want to do it graduated there, and that's darkening the grass in the foreground so that I'm not looking at it for the image. Now, we've processed this image, it looks good, we've seen the masks. Let's take a look at what happens if we start playing around with the idea of adding a color tone to it. And so to do this, we're going to go back to the black and white panel, and we're going to go ahead and click under split tone, and under here pardon me, you're going to go ahead and choose shadows only, and you're going to basically grab and choose a hue that you want. So I'm going to put it towards the yellows, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, and as I pull this up, you guys can notice that the image is starting to change, and this is very powerful to create a toned image. In fact, this was the way that Lightroom used to do it, where it had both a shadow and a highlight area to do this, and it created a very strong image. Just a warning though, don't do the highlights and the shadows. You're only supposed to do the shadows. A lot of people like to play around with the shadows and the highlights. For example, here's a color image, and someone might go in here and start messing with these, except they don't work in this, but they might make a really funky looking image. In here, if I was to pull in, choose some odd color, let's say maybe in the blues, and then pull up the saturation of the highlights, it starts creating like a weird, kind of ugly looking split tone image, which is not what we want. We were doing duotone, so we're only really working in the shadows. So once we're good here, you've got your image, it's been toned, it's a duotone, it's ready to go. You can go ahead and export this out as a PST, send it over to Lightroom, and make a print of it.